The imperialist drive to secure and expand the profits of monopoly capital has been at the center of imperialism throughout its existence. The Russian revolutionary Lenin explained this in 1915, and his explanation remains true today. This drive has taken different forms. This includes the two inter-imperialist world slaughters of the last century. It includes the so-called Cold War with the socialist camp, with its threat of thermonuclear annihilation during the existence of the Soviet Union. It includes the hot wars in Korea and Vietnam, and wars of conquest against oppressed nations. While the form of the war drive has changed once again since the disappearance of the USSR, its fundamental nature remained. It led to the air war against Yugoslavia, the occupation of Afghanistan, and the invasion and attempted conquest of Iraq. Imperialist actions are determined by this war drive and by the interaction of different ruling class factions within and without the two big capitalist parties. The ruling class is not so united that everything can arise through a grand conspiracy. Nevertheless, there is one particular strategy that has been absorbed and integrated into the Pentagon and the U.S. international state apparatus. This strategy was made public in March 1992 after the collapse of the USSR and toward the end of the first Bush, the Bush Senior administration. It was expounded in an internal Department of Defense document called the Defense Planning Guidance, and was published in part then by the New York Times. This document declared the intention of U.S. imperialism to rule the world. It warned that no power or combination of powers should even think about challenging Washington or the Pentagon, either on a regional or a global scale. Rightist Republicans prepared this document, but it had general support in the ruling class. We can use it to explain the form of the U.S. military intervention in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, the spread of NATO to Eastern Europe, and the serious threats of war against Iran today. The Bush Jr. administration was a slight aberration, as it applied the strategy of domination in such an arrogant and overconfident way that it overestimated the Pentagon's high-tech power over an occupied population. Bush used the 9/11 attack as a pretext to justify U.S. military aggression in the entire Central Asian and West Asian region, although the real goal was to conquer its world-important energy resources. This goal, too, fit the general strategy. U.S. imperialism's monopoly control of the energy resources would give it an unbeatable trump card in its economic rivalry with other imperialist powers, not to mention it being itself a source of profit. This would also hold regarding a possible conquest of Iran. The unilateral approach is being adjusted under the Democratic administration, but that without a real change in goals. Now, more than 6 years after Bush declared a quick victory in Iraq, the war has become a long-term debacle for U.S. imperialism. The determined resistance of the Iraqi people has exposed the Pentagon's weakness, which includes having its ground troops stretched to their limit and demoralized. Despite the many announcements that give the impression of withdrawal, some 134,000 U.S. troops still remain in Iraq. And according to Dodger Mail, that reporter who expert on Iraq, U.S. troops and higher paid mercenaries are expanding and improving the rural bases and even building new ones, even as the U.S. pulls out of the cities. If the Obama administration sticks to the announced timetable, at least 50,000 U.S. troops will remain in Iraq until at least the end of 2011. Despite the overwhelming weight of U.S. weapons, despite the lack of support from neighboring countries, despite the lack of a safe base from which it can organize a political struggle, Despite the difficulties in establishing a unified national liberation front, the Iraqi resistance has stopped the U.S. occupiers from a clean conquest. And the Iraqis have also raised obstacles for the Pentagon regarding launching further actions that involve seizing and occupying territory for which they would need a conscripted military. Except in Afghanistan, of course, their U.S. troop levels have already grown to 57,000, or it's set to rise to 68,000 during the year. Occupation troop vets have reached a monthly high in July. European leaders have ignored growing anti-war sentiment to send troops to the Afghan front to make sure that they get a seat at the imperialist table to share the spoils. Along with Afghanistan is increased U.S. intervention in Pakistan. Both drones and planes with pilots are sent to bomb and rocket alleged insurgent targets, while the Pentagon pushes the Pakistani regime to send its army into border areas. In both Afghanistan and Pakistan, the imperialist intervention has increased civilian deaths and created millions of refugees. They have also increased recruiting by resistance forces in both countries. Washington's policy toward Palestine has been to continue support for the Israeli state, despite Israelis' refusal to even stop new settlements in the occupied West Bank and the brutal blockade of the Gaza territory. This support is based on U.S. strategic interests in the region, which involve relying upon the Israeli state as a weapon against any liberation movement or sovereign government in the region, such as Iran. This includes the Israeli threats to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, using them as a constant pressure on elements in the Iranian ruling class who would like to normalize relations with the United States, even if this means making severe concessions. In the entire region, Washington hasn't altered its basic policy of occupation, control, and domination since the replacement of the neocon regime fronted by Bush. Most observers might agree that an imperialist military strike on Iran, and especially an invasion, could turn into a real disaster for U.S. imperialism, even more so than Iraq and Afghanistan. This doesn't mean we can rule out such a war, since imperialism is driven not by intelligent and rational strategy, but by an irrepressible need to expand. This drive even stronger in times of economic crisis. If it were based only on intelligence, would the Japanese imperialism have bombed Pearl Harbor, or German imperialism invaded the Soviet Union? But the imperialists' first step is to attempt subversion to weaken or overthrow the state power in Iran. Iran is the only intact state with some popular support and sovereignty in the region, and thus an obstacle to U.S. interests. It is entirely consistent with their past misdeeds that the corporate media and all imperialist politicians, at least in North America and Europe, have targeted the Iranian government over the elections and have praised the opposition demonstrations. They have exaggerated the support for the opposition, have exaggerated the state repression, and have given enormous publicity to the Iranian events compared, for example, to the treatment of the Honduran military coup and the resistance there, which is a revolutionary and democratic resistance. Whatever the motive of the protesters themselves in Tehran, the imperialist motive is to eliminate Iranian sovereignty and reverse the 1979 revolution. It is conceivable that a movement could arise in Iran that opposes the government and which could place in power a regime that is even more of a threat to imperialist interests. In the current case, I insist that the progressive movement in the United States question and counter the imperialist propaganda directed at the Islamic Republic, and be aware of the danger of subversion and the ever-present threat of military action, imperialist hands off Iran.